Take your things and leave, Mom. This house belongs to us now, my daughter-in-law said, standing in the doorway of the home I had lived in for 35 years. And in that moment, I realized something strange about betrayal. It rarely arrives with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in polite voices and careful smiles, like a letter you never expected to receive. I remember the way the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor that day, the same floor my husband Robert and I had installed together more than 2 decades earlier. The light made long golden lines across the living room, touching the old oak coffee table, the faded blue couch, and the framed photos of birthdays and holidays that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Melissa stood there with her arms folded, her expression tight but controlled, as if she were explaining something perfectly reasonable. Behind her, my son Daniel lingered near the kitchen island, staring down at his phone like a teenager who had been asked a question he didn't want to answer. I had raised that boy in this house. I had watched him take his first steps across this very floor. I had packed his lunches for school, helped him with science projects at the dining room table, and stayed awake late at night worrying about the kind of man he would become. And now he wouldn't even look me in the eye. We've been talking about this for weeks. Melissa continued in that same calm voice, the kind people use when they believe they are being generous. It's just not practical for you to stay here anymore. I stood beside the staircase, holding the railing the way people do when they're trying to steady themselves without making it obvious. My mind was still catching up with what was happening. Robert had been gone for only 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the quiet morning when his coffee had gone cold on the kitchen counter and the house had become too silent to bear. 3 weeks since I had stood in the church parking lot thanking people for casseroles and condolences while trying to remember how to breathe. In those 3 weeks, I had expected grief. I had expected loneliness. What I hadn't expected was eviction. Your father and I bought this house together, I said finally, though even. As the words left my mouth, I could hear how small they sounded. Daniel shifted his weight, but still didn't meet my eyes. Dad handled the paperwork, he said quietly. Things are different now. Different. It was such a simple word, but it carried the weight of a door closing somewhere behind me. Melissa stepped aside and gestured toward the front hallway, where a small navy suitcase sat upright beside the coat rack. For a moment, I thought my heart might actually stop, because I hadn't packed that suitcase. Someone else had. The handle was extended the way Robert used to do when we traveled, and a folded cardigan was tucked carefully under the strap on top. It looked neat, almost thoughtful, which somehow made it worse. We already called a rideshare for you, Melissa said. There's a motel about 10 minutes down the highway. It's clean, and it should be fine until you figure out your next step. I turned toward Daniel then, hoping, no, needing, to see something in his face that would tell me this was all a misunderstanding. But the only thing I saw there was discomfort, the kind people feel when they know something is wrong, but have already decided not to interfere. In that moment, I understood something that took me years to fully accept. Silence can be louder than cruelty. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked to the hallway, lifted the suitcase, and paused for one last look at the living room. The grandfather clock near the window ticked steadily, marking each second with the same patient rhythm it had kept for decades. Robert had wound that clock every Sunday morning. I wondered who would wind it now. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain and freshly cut grass. Our front porch light flickered on automatically as the sun dipped behind the trees, the same motion sensor Robert had insisted on installing after we retired. The rideshare car pulled into the driveway just as I stepped onto the walkway. The driver rolled down his window and asked if I was Evelyn. I nodded and placed the suitcase in the trunk. As the car pulled away, I watched the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror. 35 years of memories disappearing inch by inch behind us. 10 minutes later, we arrived at a roadside motel with a flickering neon sign that buzzed softly in the evening air. The room smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. I set my suitcase on the edge of the bed and sat beside it, listening to the distant sound of traffic moving along the highway. For a long time, I just stared at my hands. The thin gold wedding band Robert had given me still rested on my finger, warm against my skin. Robert had always been a careful man. He read contracts twice before signing them. He kept folders of documents labeled in his precise handwriting. He planned things years in advance, from retirement accounts to garden layouts. And that was the thought that kept circling in my mind as the motel room grew darker around me. Because Robert Carter was many things, stubborn, practical, sometimes overly cautious, but careless was never one of them. Which meant that if my own son believed I could simply be pushed out of the house Robert and I built together, then somewhere, somehow, something about that belief had to be wrong. I didn't know what it was yet, but I could feel it the same way you feel thunder before a storm, quiet and distant, waiting just beyond the horizon. The motel room felt smaller in the morning light than it had the night before, as if the walls themselves had leaned inward during the night while I slept. I woke before the alarm on my phone, the way people do when their lives have been rearranged without warning. For a moment, I did not remember where I was. Then I saw the thin beige curtains, the small table with a plastic coffee maker, and the faded carpet beneath my feet, and everything came back at once. 35 years in one home, and now I was waking up beside a suitcase in a roadside motel 10 miles away. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the quiet hum of traffic outside the window. The highway was just beyond the tree line, and every few seconds a car passed with a soft rushing sound that faded into the distance. It reminded me of the ocean in a strange way, steady and indifferent. I poured a cup of motel coffee, even though I knew it would taste weak. Robert used to grind fresh beans every morning in the kitchen at home. He insisted that coffee should smell strong enough to wake the whole house. As the machine sputtered and hissed, I found myself remembering the way he used to stand by the window in his robe, reading the newspaper while the morning light came through the maple tree in the yard. For years that had been the rhythm of our mornings. I realized then that the silence in the motel room was not the same silence I had felt in the house after Robert passed away. That silence had been heavy with grief. This one felt different. This one felt like waiting. I carried the cup to the small table near the window and sat down with my phone. There were 3 new messages from Daniel. I had not opened any of them yet. I stared at his name on the screen for a long time before finally tapping the first one. It read simply, "We hope you got settled in somewhere comfortable. Melissa and I are just trying to do what is best for everyone." The second message said that they had already spoken with a real estate agent about preparing the house for sale. The third message said that if I needed help finding a senior community, they would be willing to research options. I set the phone face down on the table and took a slow sip of the coffee. It tasted exactly the way I expected, thin and slightly bitter. The kind of coffee that exists only to prove that morning has arrived. I did not reply to Daniel. Instead, I looked down at the wedding ring on my finger again. Robert had slipped that ring onto my hand on a warm spring afternoon more than 35 years earlier. He had been nervous during the ceremony, and he had whispered that the band might be slightly too large. I had laughed and told him it would stay exactly where it belonged. Robert had always believed in preparation. It was one of the first things I noticed about him when we were young. He kept folders for everything. Insurance papers, bank statements, property tax receipts. Even grocery budgets were written neatly on lined paper. When Daniel was in high school, Robert once spent an entire weekend reorganizing our filing cabinet because he said it was important that every document in our lives could be found within 2 minutes. That memory returned to me now with surprising clarity. I finished the last sip of coffee and stood up slowly. The suitcase beside the bed was still half open from the night before. Melissa must have packed it quickly because the clothes inside were folded unevenly. On top of the stack was my gray cardigan, the one Robert always said made me look comfortable even on bad days. I lifted it carefully and placed it over the back of the chair. Then I sat on the bed again and tried to remember something very specific. During the last year of Robert's life, he had started saying a sentence that puzzled me every time I heard it. "If anything ever feels wrong, Evelyn, promise me you will talk to Mr. Bennett before you sign anything." At the time, I thought he was only referring to ordinary legal matters. Mr. Bennett had been Robert's attorney for almost 20 years. He helped with the paperwork when Robert retired from the construction company, and he reviewed our wills every few years. But now that sentence felt different. Now it sounded less like routine advice and more like a quiet instruction left behind for a moment exactly like this one. I stood and walked to the window. The motel parking lot was nearly empty except for a pickup truck and a silver sedan parked near the office. The morning sun had climbed above the trees, and the air outside looked clear and cool. I realized that since leaving the house, I had done nothing except react. I had followed instructions. I had accepted the ride. I had checked into the motel. Everything had been happening to me rather than because of me. Robert would not have liked that. He believed in understanding a situation before surrendering to it. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Harold Bennett. My thumb hovered above the call button for a moment. I was not even sure why I felt the need to call him. Maybe it was only habit. Maybe it was only because Robert had trusted him. Or maybe it was because deep down I felt the same quiet pressure I had felt the night before. The sense that something about this situation did not fit the careful life Robert had built. I pressed the call button before I could change my mind. The phone rang twice. Then a familiar calm voice answered on the other end. "Good morning, Evelyn. I was just about to call you." For a moment, I did not say anything after hearing Harold Bennett's voice on the phone. The morning light through the motel window felt suddenly sharper, as if the world had leaned forward to listen. I cleared my throat and said that I was sorry to call so early. Harold replied gently that I was not interrupting him at all. In fact, he said he had been planning to reach me since the previous evening but had not been certain where I was staying. The way he said that sentence made my chest tighten slightly. It suggested that he already knew something had happened. I asked him how he knew I might need to speak with him. There was a pause on the line, the kind that experienced professionals use when they are choosing their words carefully. Then he said that Robert had left very specific instructions about contacting him under certain circumstances. My fingers tightened around the phone as I sat back down on the edge of the motel bed. Robert had always been precise with instructions, but hearing that he had anticipated a moment like this sent a strange mixture of comfort and unease through me. Harold continued in the same calm tone and explained that Robert had prepared several documents during the final year of his life. Most of them were routine estate planning, but one item had been placed in a sealed envelope with a very unusual condition attached. According to Robert, the envelope was only to be opened if I ever found myself being pressured to leave the house, or if I was denied access to property decisions related to our home. For a few seconds I could not speak. Outside the motel window, a truck passed slowly along the highway, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. I told Harold that the condition he described sounded strangely familiar. I explained that the day before my daughter-in-law had asked me to leave the house, and that my son had supported her decision without discussion. Harold did not sound surprised. Instead, he let out a slow breath and said quietly that he thought something like this might eventually happen. He asked if I would be able to meet him at his office that afternoon. His building was located downtown about 12 miles from the motel, and he suggested we speak in person before any decisions were made. I agreed immediately. After ending the call, I sat there for several minutes holding the phone in both hands. The room felt different now, as if the small space had suddenly become a waiting room before something important. I folded my gray cardigan neatly into the suitcase and changed into the navy blouse Robert always said looked professional enough for any appointment. It had been years since I visited Harold's office alone. Robert usually handled our legal meetings while I listened quietly beside him, trusting his steady confidence with documents and contracts. The drive into town took about 20 minutes. The morning traffic was light, and the sky had cleared into a bright blue that made the buildings downtown appear sharper than usual. Harold's office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had been there since the 1950s. The brass plaque near the entrance read Bennett Legal Services in simple engraved letters. When I stepped inside the reception area, the scent of polished wood and paper files reminded me instantly of past visits with Robert. Harold's assistant greeted me warmly and led me down the hallway to the conference room where Harold was already waiting. He stood when I entered and shook my hand with both of his, a gesture that carried quiet sympathy without the awkwardness of formal condolences. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Harold reached into a leather briefcase on the table and removed a large cream-colored envelope sealed with a thin gold strip. My name was written across the front in Robert's familiar handwriting. Seeing those letters felt like hearing his voice again after weeks of silence. Harold placed the envelope gently on the table between us and explained that Robert had delivered it to him 8 months earlier during a routine review of our estate documents. At the time, Robert had said that he hoped the envelope would never be needed. However, he also insisted that if the specific situation written in his instructions ever occurred, Harold must contact me and open the letter in my presence. I asked what those instructions said exactly. Harold unfolded a single sheet of paper from his folder and read the line Robert had written. It stated that if Evelyn Carter was ever asked or pressured to leave the residence located at Maple Ridge Drive, or if she was denied her rightful authority regarding the property. The sealed letter was to be opened immediately and the contents explained without delay. Hearing those words made something shift quietly inside my chest. Robert had not been careless. He had been watching. Harold looked at me carefully and asked if the condition described in Robert's instructions had truly taken place. I nodded slowly and told him everything that happened the previous afternoon. I described the suitcase in the hallway, the quiet conversation, and the way my son refused to meet my eyes. Harold listened without interrupting. When I finished, he placed both hands on the envelope for a moment, as if weighing its importance. Then he said something that made the room feel suddenly very still. "Evelyn," he said, "your husband anticipated that this moment might come, and what he wrote in this letter could change everything you believe about what happened yesterday." Harold's words settled into the quiet conference room like dust in sunlight. For a few seconds I did not move. The envelope with my name on it rested on the polished wooden table between us, and I could not stop staring at the familiar shape of Robert's handwriting. The letters were steady and deliberate, just the way he always wrote grocery lists or labeled file folders at home. Seeing that handwriting again felt like a small bridge reaching across the empty weeks since he had passed away. Harold slid the envelope slightly closer to me, but did not open it yet. Instead, he folded his hands and looked at me with the careful expression of someone who understands that a single moment can divide a life into before and after. "Evelyn," he said gently, "before I open this, I need to explain something your husband made very clear. Robert believed that if this letter was ever opened, it would mean that a serious misunderstanding had taken place inside your family. He did not write this out of anger. He wrote it because he believed you deserved clarity and protection." I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the table. The word protection echoed in my mind in a way that made my heartbeat quicken. Robert had always been protective, but he was also a man who trusted people, especially his own son. The idea that he had prepared something like this suggested that he had seen signs long before I ever did. Harold carefully broke the gold seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter and several printed documents clipped neatly together. The soft sound of paper unfolding filled the room. Harold glanced at the first page, then looked back at me. "Would you prefer that I read it aloud?" he asked. "Or would you like to read it yourself?" My voice felt steadier than I expected when I answered. "Please read it." Hearing Robert's words out loud somehow felt right. Harold nodded and adjusted his glasses. The letter began with a line written in Robert's unmistakable voice. "Evelyn, if you are hearing this letter, then something I feared may have already happened. I want you to know first that none of what follows was written because I doubted you. I wrote it because I know how easily good intentions can be misunderstood and how quickly circumstances can change after a person is gone." I felt a quiet warmth spread through my chest as Harold continued reading. Robert wrote that during the final year of his life, he had spent many evenings reviewing our finances and property documents. At first, it had simply been part of organizing things before retirement. But as he examined the paperwork more closely, he realized that our home and several related assets could become complicated if decisions were made too quickly after his passing. He wrote that he trusted Daniel to be a good man, but he also knew that Daniel often avoided conflict and allowed stronger personalities to guide important choices. Robert did not mention Melissa by name in a harsh way. Instead, he described her as determined and ambitious, someone who believed strongly in moving forward without hesitation. According to Robert, that combination of traits could create pressure around the house once he was no longer there to balance conversations. Harold paused briefly and looked at me before continuing. Robert Letter then explained that he had taken steps to ensure that I would always have complete authority over the house we shared. The property at Maple Ridge Drive, he wrote, was legally structured in a way that guaranteed my right to live there and control decisions regarding it for the rest of my life. Even if other family members believed otherwise, the documents attached to the letter would confirm that no sale, transfer, or renovation of the home could take place without my direct written approval. As Harold spoke those words, I felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. For the past 24 hours, I had been thinking about the house as something I had already lost. But Robert's voice inside that letter was calmly explaining that the foundation beneath those fears might not be as solid as it seemed. Harold turned to the next page. Robert's writing grew even more specific. He explained that the house had been placed within a carefully structured legal arrangement several months earlier. While Daniel was listed as a future beneficiary, the authority to manage the property remained entirely with me until I chose otherwise. Robert even included instructions that if I ever felt pressured or confused about my rights, I should contact Harold immediately and review the documents before agreeing to anything. The words felt almost surreal when spoken aloud in the quiet room. I thought back to the moment Melissa had gestured toward the suitcase in the hallway and told me the house was no longer practical for me. At the time, I had believed her confidence meant she understood the legal situation better than I did. Now it seemed possible that none of us had understood the full picture except Robert himself. Harold finished reading the letter and carefully set it down on the table. The conference room was silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock near the window. Finally, he spoke again, his tone thoughtful rather than dramatic. "Evelyn, your husband was very thorough. These documents clearly establish your authority regarding the house. Legally speaking, no one can remove you from that property or sell it without your consent." The realization settled slowly in my mind like sunlight spreading across a floor at dawn. Only the day before I had walked away from the house believing I had no place left there. Now, according to Robert's own carefully written plan, the opposite might be true. I looked down at the letter again, tracing the edges of the paper with my fingertips. Robert had not raised his voice or made accusations in his final words. Instead, he had done what he always did best. He had quietly prepared for the future and trusted that when the right moment arrived, the truth would reveal itself. For a long moment after Harold finished speaking, neither of us said anything. The quiet inside the conference room felt almost ceremonial, like the pause that follows the final note of a song. I kept looking at the letter on the table, half expecting Robert's handwriting to shift or fade the way dreams do when morning arrives. But the paper remained exactly where Harold had placed it, steady and real beneath the warm overhead light. Finally, Harold slid the attached documents toward me and began explaining them one by one in the calm, measured tone he used whenever legal details became important. Robert, he said, had established something called a life estate combined with a protective trust structure for the Maple Ridge Drive property. In simple terms, it meant that while Daniel might one day inherit the house, the authority over the property belonged entirely to me for the rest of my life. No one could force a sale, transfer ownership, or remove me from the residence without my explicit written consent. Harold even pointed to several clauses that Robert had insisted be written in unusually clear language so that there would be no confusion. I listened carefully while tracing the edge of the page with my finger. The more Harold explained, the more the events of the previous day began to look different in my memory. When Melissa had stood in the doorway and told me the house belonged to them now, she had spoken with such certainty that I never questioned it. I had assumed Daniel must have handled the legal paperwork after Robert passed away. But according to the documents in front of me, nothing about that assumption was correct. Robert had anticipated that confusion might arise and had quietly prepared a structure that protected my place in that house regardless of anyone else's expectations. Harold leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together. "Your husband was a very thoughtful man," he said. "He did not want conflict in your family, but he also did not want you to feel vulnerable if circumstances changed." I nodded slowly, remembering how often Robert would double-check things before making decisions. Even small purchases had required careful thought from him. The idea that he had prepared something this thorough did not surprise me once I allowed myself to think about it clearly. What surprised me was how little attention I had paid to those preparations while he was alive. I had trusted him completely, and perhaps that trust had allowed me to remain comfortably unaware of the details. Harold then asked a question that made me pause. "Evelyn," he said, "did you sign any documents yesterday before leaving the house?" I shook my head immediately. No one had asked me to sign anything. Melissa had only told me that it would be easier for everyone if I stayed somewhere else for a while. Harold gave a small nod that suggested he was pleased to hear that answer. "That was wise," he said. "Once paperwork becomes involved, situations can grow more complicated very quickly. The way things stand now, your legal position remains exactly the way Robert intended it." I let out a quiet breath that I did not realize I had been holding. Outside the conference room window, the afternoon sun had moved across the sky, casting long reflections on the glass buildings across the street. People walked along the sidewalk below carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that a simple letter on a table upstairs had just changed the direction of someone else's life. Harold carefully gathered the documents and placed them back into the folder. Then he slid the letter itself toward me so that I could hold it. The paper felt smooth and slightly warm beneath my fingertips. Robert closing lines were written in the same steady handwriting as the beginning. Evelyn, he had written, if you are reading this, then it means life has taken a turn neither of us hoped for. Remember that this house was built with years of patience and care, and it represents more than walls and property lines. It represents a place where your voice matters. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. I read those sentences twice before setting the letter back on the table. The weight in my chest that had followed me since the moment I stepped into that rideshare car the day before began to feel lighter, not because everything was suddenly simple, but because the uncertainty had begun to lift. Harold watched me quietly for a moment before speaking again. The next step, he said, is entirely up to you. Legally, you have every right to return to the house whenever you choose. If you prefer, I can also contact your son and explain the situation directly, so there is no misunderstanding about your authority regarding the property. I considered his offer carefully. Part of me wanted to drive straight back to Maple Ridge Drive and walk through the front door without saying a word. Another part of me understood that sudden actions often create unnecessary tension. Robert had always believed in calm clarity rather than dramatic gestures. I placed my hands gently on the table and looked at Harold. I think it would be best if we take this step by step, I said. Harold nodded with the quiet approval of someone who appreciated thoughtful decisions. Very well, he replied. We will move forward carefully and make sure everyone understands the truth. As I gathered the folder and stood to leave the office, the hallway outside seemed brighter than it had earlier that afternoon. The world itself had not changed during those few hours, but my understanding of it had shifted in a way that felt steady and irreversible. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was no longer a memory I had been forced to abandon. It was still, in every meaningful way, a place where my life continued to belong. I left Harold Bennett's office carrying the folder against my chest the way someone carries something fragile that cannot be replaced. The afternoon air outside the brick building felt warm and steady, and for the first time since the day before I noticed the quiet rhythm of the city around me. Cars moved slowly along the street. A bus paused at the corner, and somewhere nearby a church bell marked the half hour. Nothing in the world looked unusual, yet the ground beneath my thoughts had shifted in a way that felt impossible to ignore. When I reached my car, I sat behind the steering wheel for a moment without starting the engine. The folder rested on the passenger seat, its edges catching the sunlight that came through the windshield. Inside were the documents Robert had prepared months before anyone imagined they would be needed. I could almost hear his voice explaining things patiently the way he always did when finances or property were involved. Robert never rushed decisions. He believed the best protection for the future was preparation made quietly in the present. I started the engine and drove slowly through downtown traffic. The motel where I had spent the night was only 15 minutes away, but I was in no hurry to return to that small temporary room. Instead, I turned onto Maple Avenue and followed the road along the park where Robert and I used to walk on Sunday mornings. The trees were tall and full with late summer leaves, and a few families sat on benches near the walking path, while children rode bicycles in wide circles on the pavement. Watching those ordinary scenes reminded me how many years of ordinary life Robert and I had shared before everything changed. For a long time, our house on Maple Ridge Drive had been simply the place where those ordinary days unfolded. It had never occurred to me that the house itself might one day become the center of a quiet storm inside our own family. I parked near the edge of the park and opened the folder again. The papers Harold had shown me were precise and carefully organized. Robert's handwriting appeared in several places where he had added notes or signed confirmations. One sentence near the bottom of a page caught my attention more than the others. It explained that the purpose of the arrangement was to ensure that Evelyn Carter retains full and peaceful use of the residence without interference or pressure from any external party. I read that sentence 3 times. The words peaceful use stayed with me longer than the rest. Robert had not written about ownership or control as abstract legal ideas. He had written about peace. He wanted the house to remain a place where I could live without feeling uncertain about my place there. As I closed the folder again, my phone vibrated softly in my purse. I already knew who it would be before I looked at the screen. Daniel's name appeared with a new message notification. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The message was longer than the ones he had sent earlier that morning. He wrote that he hoped I had time to think about the situation and that Melissa believed it would be best for everyone if we discussed selling the house soon. He said the real estate market was strong and that moving quickly would allow everyone to move forward with their lives. The phrase "move forward" appeared twice in the message, as if repeating it would make the decision sound more reasonable. I set the phone back on the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield at the trees in the park. Robert had once told Daniel that moving forward does not always mean moving faster. Sometimes it means stopping long enough to understand where you actually stand. I wondered if Daniel remembered that conversation now. For the first time since leaving the house, I did not feel the heavy confusion that had followed me through the previous 24 hours. Instead, I felt something quieter and steadier forming beneath my thoughts. The truth about the house was no longer hidden. Robert had written it down clearly, and Harold had confirmed it in language that left very little room for misunderstanding. Whatever Daniel and Melissa believed about their authority over the property, the documents told a different story. I started the car again and drove back toward the motel. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, and long shadows stretched across the road ahead of me. When I reached the motel parking lot, I remained seated in the car for another minute before going inside. The small room looked exactly the same as it had that morning, with the same thin curtains and quiet hum of the highway in the distance. Yet my perspective had changed in a subtle but powerful way. Yesterday, this room had felt like the beginning of an uncertain exile. Now it felt more like a temporary waiting place before the next step of a conversation that had not yet finished. I placed the folder on the small desk beside the window and opened it once more. The letter Robert wrote rested on top of the other papers. His final lines returned to my mind with a clarity that made the quiet motel room feel less lonely. Remember that this house represents a place where your voice matters. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. I read those words again slowly. Then I closed the folder, picked up my phone, and began typing a message to Harold Bennett confirming that I would like his help arranging a meeting with Daniel and Melissa as soon as possible. It seemed to me that the truth Robert had prepared deserved to be heard clearly and calmly by everyone involved. And for the first time since I had stepped onto that front porch with a suitcase the day before, the idea of returning to Maple Ridge Drive no longer felt like something uncertain in the distance. It felt like the natural continuation of a story that Robert himself had already begun to write. I slept more deeply that night than I expected, not because the motel bed was comfortable, but because my thoughts finally had direction. When morning arrived, the room, filled with pale sunlight that slipped through the thin curtains and spread across the carpet like quiet reassurance. For the first time since leaving the house on Maple Ridge Drive, I did not wake with the heavy confusion that had followed me the previous morning. Instead, there was a calm clarity resting beneath everything I did. I prepared a simple breakfast using the small coffee maker and sat by the window while the highway traffic slowly increased outside. People were beginning their workdays, driving toward offices, schools, and shops, each car moving with purpose. Watching them reminded me that life rarely pauses for long when circumstances change. It simply keeps moving forward while people inside it learn how to adjust. My phone rested on the small table beside the cup of coffee. Late the previous evening, Harold Bennett had replied to my message confirming that he would arrange a meeting with Daniel and Melissa. He suggested the conference room at his office because it was a neutral place where everyone could speak calmly and where the documents Robert prepared could be explained clearly. Harold had also written that he believed a direct conversation would prevent confusion and allow everyone to understand the legal situation without unnecessary tension. I appreciated the careful way he approached the matter. Robert had always respected that quality in him. Around 9 o'clock, my phone vibrated again. A new message from Harold appeared on the screen confirming that he had contacted Daniel and that they had agreed to meet the following afternoon. Reading those words created a small shift in my chest, the kind that happens when something long anticipated finally becomes real. The meeting would not be dramatic. I already knew that much. Robert had never believed in drama. Instead, it would be a quiet moment where truth replaced assumption. After finishing my coffee, I dressed carefully and placed the folder containing the documents back into my bag. Even though the meeting Was not until the next day I felt a strong desire to drive past Maple Ridge Drive before returning to Herald office. I did not intend to stop at the house or announce my presence. I only wanted to see it again from the road, the way someone might look at a familiar landmark while traveling through a city they once called home. The drive across town took about 20 minutes. When I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, the neighborhood looked exactly the way it always had. The lawns were trimmed neatly, and the maple trees along the sidewalk formed a green arch above the street. A few neighbors were walking their dogs, and someone down the block was watering flower beds near the porch. The calmness of the scene felt almost surreal after everything that had happened inside that same street less than 2 days earlier. I slowed the car as I passed our house. The white siding looked freshly painted just as Robert had insisted the previous spring. The porch swing we installed years ago moved slightly in the breeze. For a moment the house appeared unchanged, as if the previous afternoon had been nothing more than a brief misunderstanding that the walls themselves had refused to acknowledge. Daniel's car was parked in the driveway. Through the living room window, I could see faint movement, perhaps Melissa walking from one room to another. I did not stop the car. Instead, I continued slowly down the street and turned the corner toward the main road. Something about that short drive filled me with quiet determination. The house was not simply a structure made of wood and brick. It was the center of decades of ordinary life. Robert and I had built routines there, celebrated holidays there, and watched Daniel grow from a child into an adult within those rooms. Robert's final letter had reminded me of something important, that history deserved respect. When I arrived back at the motel, I spent the afternoon reviewing the documents again. Each clause confirmed the same essential truth. Robert had ensured that my voice remained the deciding authority regarding the house. No one could remove me from it or sell it without my consent. The language was clear and unmistakable. Late in the evening, Daniel sent another message asking if we could speak soon about the future of the property. I read the message once and then placed the phone on the table without answering. Tomorrow the conversation would take place in the presence of Harold and the documents Robert prepared. That setting would allow everyone to hear the truth directly rather than through speculation. As the sky darkened outside the motel window, I opened Robert's letter one more time and read the final lines slowly. Remember that this house represents a place where your voice matters. Those words carried a quiet strength that filled the small room around me. Tomorrow that voice would be heard clearly for the first time since the afternoon when a suitcase had appeared in the hallway. And this time the conversation would begin not with assumptions, but with the careful plan Robert had written long before anyone realized it would be needed. The following afternoon arrived with a quiet steadiness that reminded me of the calm before a long-awaited conversation. I dressed carefully, choosing the same navy blouse I had worn the previous day because it carried a sense of composure that felt appropriate for what was about to happen. The folder containing Robert's letter and the accompanying documents rested inside my bag, and I checked twice to make sure everything was there before leaving the motel. The drive to Harold Bennett's office felt shorter than it had the day before, perhaps because my thoughts were clearer now. When I parked outside the brick building, I noticed Daniel's car already sitting in the small lot near the entrance. For a moment, I remained seated behind the steering wheel, watching the reflection of the afternoon sky across the windshield. The meeting ahead of me would not be about anger or confrontation. It would simply be about truth. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance with a calm pace that surprised even me. Inside the reception area, Harold's assistant greeted me politely and guided me down the hallway toward the conference room. The door was slightly open. Through the narrow gap, I could see Daniel seated at the table with his hands clasped together, while Melissa sat beside him scrolling quietly through her phone. When I entered the room, both of them looked up at the same moment. Daniel stood quickly, as if uncertain how to begin speaking. Melissa offered a tight smile that seemed more formal than warm. I took the chair across from them and placed the folder gently on the table. A few seconds later, Harold stepped in behind me and closed the door with a soft click that sealed the room in quiet professionalism. "Thank you all for coming," Harold said calmly as he took his seat at the head of the table. "The purpose of this meeting is to clarify several important details regarding the property on Maple Ridge Drive and the legal arrangements Robert Carter established prior to his passing." Daniel nodded slightly, while Melissa leaned back in her chair with the kind of confident posture someone adopts when they believe the outcome is already certain. Daniel spoke first. "Mom, We were hoping to talk about selling the house, so everyone can move forward. Melissa and I already spoke with a real estate agent who thinks the market is strong right now. Harold listened patiently before responding. I understand that you have been considering those options, he said. However, there are several documents your father prepared that must be reviewed before any decisions about the property can be discussed. Melissa shifted slightly in her chair. Robert will left the house to Daniel, she said quickly. That was always the understanding. Harold opened the folder and removed the letter Robert had written. Robert did indeed plan for Daniel to inherit the property eventually, Harold replied calmly. However, the timeline and authority connected to that inheritance are very clearly defined. He turned the document so that everyone at the table could see the signature at the bottom. This letter and the attached legal structure establish that Evelyn Carter retains full and exclusive authority over the residence for the remainder of her lifetime. No sale or transfer can occur without her direct approval. The words settled into the room slowly. Daniel's expression changed first. He leaned forward slightly and looked at the documents more carefully. Melissa's brows tightened as if she believed she had misunderstood what was being said. Harold continued explaining in the same steady tone he had used the previous day with me. The property was placed into a legal arrangement designed to ensure that Evelyn Carter maintains peaceful and uninterrupted use of the home. This arrangement was established months before Robert passed away, and it remains fully enforceable. Melissa sat upright now, her earlier confidence fading into visible confusion. But Daniel is the beneficiary, she said again. Eventually, Harold answered gently. But until Evelyn decides otherwise, the authority regarding the property belongs entirely to her. Daniel looked across the table toward me with an expression that seemed both surprised and uncertain. Mom, he said quietly, I did not realize Dad arranged things that way. I held his gaze calmly and answered with the same steady tone I had practiced in my thoughts the night before. Your father believed the house should remain a place where my voice mattered. That was his exact wording. Harold placed the documents neatly back into the folder and folded his hands together. The purpose of this structure was not to create conflict, he said. It was simply to protect Evelyn's position so that no decisions about the home would be made without her consent. The silence that followed felt different from the awkward quiet of the previous days. This silence carried understanding rather than confusion. Daniel nodded slowly as if pieces of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. Melissa did not speak for several seconds. Then she looked down at the table, her expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. Harold stood and gathered the papers carefully. Now that everyone understands the legal situation, he said, the next steps can be discussed calmly. But one fact remains clear. The home on Maple Ridge Drive belongs to Evelyn Authority for as long as she chooses. And no one in this room has the right to take that place away from her. I remained seated for a moment after Harold finished speaking, letting the quiet settle naturally around the table. No one rushed to fill the silence. The documents lay between us like a calm, steady answer that no longer needed explanation. Daniel looked down at his hands for a long time before he finally spoke. His voice was softer than it had been during the previous days. Mom, he said slowly, I did not understand how Dad arranged everything. I thought after he passed away the house automatically became my responsibility. I shook my head gently, not in anger but in quiet acknowledgement of how easily assumptions can grow when truth is not fully known. Your father was careful with things like this, I said. He wanted to make sure the house remained a place where decisions were made calmly and not in a rush. Melissa sat very still beside him. The confident tone she had used 2 days earlier had disappeared. When she finally spoke, her voice carried more uncertainty than before. I believe Daniel was already responsible for the property, she said. We were trying to think about the future and what would be practical for everyone. I listened without interrupting, remembering the moment she had stood in the doorway and told me the house was no longer practical for me. Now the words sounded different when spoken in the quiet space of a conference room rather than in the hallway of a home. Harold folded the letter and placed it back into the folder with careful precision. Robert understood that situations can be misunderstood after someone passes away, he said calmly. That is why he prepared these instructions so clearly. He wanted to remove uncertainty rather than create conflict. Daniel nodded slowly, as if that explanation finally aligned with what he remembered about his father. Dad always planned ahead, he said quietly. I looked at him across the table and saw a trace of the boy he used to be when Robert would explain tools and building materials in the garage on Saturday mornings. Robert believed that planning ahead was the best way to protect people from unnecessary confusion. In this moment, that belief was doing exactly what he intended. Melissa finally leaned forward slightly and looked directly at me. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "I want you to know that I never intended to make you feel unwelcome. I thought we were simply making practical decisions." Her voice was sincere, though still cautious, as if she was choosing each word carefully. I appreciated the effort, even though the memory of that suitcase in the hallway remained clear in my mind. "Practical decisions," I said gently, "should always begin with understanding all the facts." That is something Robert believed strongly. Harold nodded in quiet agreement. "Now that the documents have been reviewed," he said, "everyone understands that Evelyn retains full authority regarding the home on Maple Ridge Drive. What happens next is entirely her decision." The room grew still again as those words settled into place. For the first time since the conversation began, all three of them were looking at me, waiting for my answer. I did not feel rushed. The decision had been forming quietly since the moment I read Robert's letter in the motel room the previous night. I folded my hands together on the table and spoke in the same calm tone Robert used when he explained plans for the future. "The house on Maple Ridge Drive will not be sold," I said. "Your father built that home with patience and care, and it will remain the place where I live." Daniel nodded slowly, accepting the statement without resistance. Melissa remained quiet, but her expression had softened into thoughtful understanding. I continued speaking, not as someone defending territory, but as someone clarifying a path forward. That house was never meant to divide this family. It was meant to hold it together. Robert wanted it to remain a place where people felt welcome rather than pushed aside. Daniel looked up at me, then with a mixture of relief and regret in his expression. "Mom," he said, "I am sorry for how everything happened the other day. I should have slowed down and asked more questions before agreeing to anything." I gave a small nod because apologies are most meaningful when they arrive without being demanded. "What matters now," I said, "is that we understand each other more clearly than before." Harold gathered the documents once more and closed the folder. Then he looked around the room with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed confusion give way to clarity. "I believe Robert would be pleased with how calmly this conversation unfolded," he said. "His goal was always to ensure that the truth remained visible." The meeting ended without raised voices or dramatic gestures. When we stood from the table, Daniel walked beside me down the hallway toward the exit. Outside, the afternoon sunlight had shifted lower in the sky, casting warm light across the brick walls of the building. For a moment, we both paused near the steps. "I will drive you back to the house if you would like," he said carefully. I considered the offer and felt a small smile form for the first time in several days. "That will not be necessary," I replied. "I have my own car." Daniel nodded and stepped aside, understanding that this return needed to happen at my own pace. When I reached the parking lot, I placed the folder on the passenger seat and started the engine. The drive toward Maple Ridge Drive felt different from the earlier drive past the house. This time I was not passing through quietly. This time I was returning with the calm certainty Robert had prepared long before anyone realized it would matter. When I turned onto our street, the maple trees were glowing softly in the evening light, and the house stood exactly where it always had, steady and familiar. I parked in the driveway, stepped out of the car, and walked up the front path. The porch boards creaked gently beneath my feet the same way they had for years. When I opened the front door, the house welcomed me with the quiet scent of wood and sunlight that had always lived inside those walls. I set the folder on the kitchen table and looked around the room where so many ordinary mornings had begun. Robert's voice echoed softly in my memory through the words he had written. "This house represents a place where your voice matters." Standing there in the quiet kitchen, I understood that his final letter had done more than protect a property. It had protected the simple truth that a home built with patience and love cannot be taken away by misunderstanding. And with that truth finally clear, Maple Ridge Drive was once again exactly what it had always been meant to be. My home.